and it's saying my internet connection is unstable. So if something happens and blows up, sorry, everyone. So yeah, thank you again for inviting me to give the department seminar today. I should probably preface this talk with, I'm not a geologist, nor do I really pretend to be a geologist, but I'm really hoping that everyone finds something interesting to kind of take away from this. And today I'll be really presenting some of the research from my PhD, which draws on principles of ecology and hydrology to better understand how these two things interact across different spatial scales in forested ecosystems in particular. Oops, having trouble advancing. And what I'll be, I really want to focus in on how sort of forest controls stream flow at short and long time scales. Now, I should be really clear here, since I'm talking to geologists, that when I say long time scales, I mean on the order of decades to maybe 100 years. I'd also like to sort of keep this talk really high level and really informal. So, I've kind of scattered a few questions throughout. That way we can maybe kind of have an engaging conversation about like what you all think some of the hypotheses are. Maybe we can work through some of my findings together. But before I sort of jump in, I think it's really important to contextualize why understanding forest ecology and hydrology together is important. So forests supply some of the highest quality surface waters in the country. This picture on the right is showing you the Scaife Reservoir located in the Catskill Mountains of New York. This is just one of 19 reservoirs that supply 8.5 million residents in New York City with drinking water. And this system of reservoirs located 100 miles from the city drains natural forest, right, in the Catskill Mountains. And to preserve both the quality and the quantity of this water, much of the land here is restricted for development. So, but despite this restriction on development, this region is still seeing increased droughts, right? And these droughts are beginning to threaten the health of forests that people rely on for drinking water. But these intensifying droughts are starting to occur elsewhere. The changing climate is also changing forests across southern Appalachia, so a little closer to home. And this is one of the wettest regions on the East Coast. And just in my lifetime alone, we've seen temperatures rise by 1.5 degrees Celsius. And at the same time, the oscillations in rainfall patterns have led to record-breaking droughts. And these sequences of dry years, as shown by these negative gray bars here, are lasting for longer periods of time and becoming more severe. And so, one of the really big impacts from these increased droughts is fire. And so this picture on the right is showing you the Rough Ridge fire, which burned in 2016. And it burned 28,000 acres in Northwest Georgia, which is, again, one of the wettest places on the East Coast, making it one of the largest fires on record. But I should also mention that, not only are fires becoming more prevalent, but other disturbances like pests and disease are leading to losses of species like chestnuts and hemlocks in these forests. And these openings in the forest are creating a lot of opportunity for new species to spread. So we're seeing the rise of things like maples and oaks within the last 40 years. So, all of this is to really say that these ecosystems are really dynamic. And from a hydrologic perspective, we know that water in our streams and rivers is controlled by how much it rains, but it's also controlled by how much water is sort of used and released by ecosystems, or in this case, by forest. The challenge is understanding how these ecosystems are changing though, right? And how they will change in the future with climate change. And then finally, what this means for water that may eventually become our drinking waters, right? So my research really asks this question of how does this dynamic vegetation regulate hydrology or regulate water that's flowing to the stream? Now, we normally think about vegetation regulating things like base flow in the stream. So base flow is like that background flow that's happening whenever it's not raining. But my research really examines all types of flow and how vegetation impacts it. So, I've already mentioned that climate change is occurring and that climate change impacts on forests happen really slowly. So, trying to get to the answer of this question requires lots of data, right? Like years and decades of data to start to see these climate signals on forests and forest dynamics. Because of this, the bulk of my research is conducted here, the Coweta Hydrologic Laboratory. Now, this is a US Forest Service research station located in southern Appalachia in southwest North Carolina, really close to the Georgia border, near where the Rough Ridge Fire occurred. It was established in the 1930s to study how vegetation impacts both hydrology, bless you, impacts hydrology and has decades of data. This is a humid forested research station that's also subdivided into watersheds, right? And it's really cool, right? Because these watersheds allow us to do neat experiments like go in and remove all of the vegetation and see what happens to our water. But not only does Coweta have decades of data, but it also has this really distinct dormant and growing season because it's a deciduous forest, right? And I think this is pretty well shown by this picture towards the top, which is showing you the canopy during the winter, and you can see that all the leaves are off. And so this is going to impart a really important signal on how vegetation controls the water flowing to the stream. I should also note, though, that there is this evergreen sort of understory or shrub called rhododendron, and that typically lives near the stream. And it's not a huge signal in these forests, but it does exist, and it's important that we acknowledge it. It's also important, actually, that I mentioned how water gets to the stream at Coweta, right? So in the 1960s, two scientists by the name of Hewlett and Hibbert showed that in humid temperate systems like Coweta, flow in the stream comes from these shallow subsurface flows. So it's not actually coming from like deep groundwater or like through flow within the bedrock. It's really within that shallow soil zone. Now this is important, right? Because this shallow zone is where all of the trees have their roots, all of those shrubs have their roots. And that means that this vegetation can extract water that might actually be flowing to the stream. So in humid systems, vegetation may control water use or may control the water that we see in the streams. But, I think to really understand how climate change is going to affect forests and water, I think we really need to understand how vegetation controls stream flow. And that's kind of what we'll talk about today. Okay, so now I kind of want us to set up some hypotheses for this talk. Remember, we're interested in how vegetation or forests, more specifically, control stream flow. And to do that, we need to understand what happens, right, to our little water droplet here when it reaches the land surface. So I didn't necessarily think this completely through, but in the chat or maybe unmuting yourself, I want you all to kind of tell me what you think some of the outputs are, or where this water droplet could potentially go after it lands on the surface of the forest. There's kind of many different ways where this water droplet can travel. So one, which you all pointed out, was evaporation or transpiration. We're going to ignore evaporation for now, right? Because we're really interested in what the vegetation is doing. So we're just going to look at kind of this transpiration piece. But there's also two big important pieces, right? There's this stream flow, and then there's this groundwater recharge potentially. And so throughout the talk, we'll kind of explore how vegetation is controlling whether this water droplet becomes transpiration or whether this water droplet becomes stream flow or maybe even groundwater recharge. Okay, so I want to complicate things a little bit more. So now let's say that the ecosystem controlling the amount of rainfall that is divided into transpiration, so that up green arrow, and then everything else, so the blue arrows, is changing, right? So this ecosystem is dynamic. And recall that Coweta is a deciduous forest. So in the wintertime, the leaves are off. So now I want you guys to tell me what happens to these arrows, or to these arrows basically when it's the dormant season. They're spot on. So getting ahead of myself. So that's right. When we move into the dormant season, we start to see a reduction in transpiration, and we have an increase in stream flow. And this is exactly what we hypothesized in a previous paper of mine. We found evidence of what you all just typed into the chat, right? In this paper, we found that the seasonal rainfall determined how much storm flow was generated. So let me sort of break this finding down a little bit more clearly using just a standard hydrograph, right? So a hydrograph just shows you the amount of flow in a stream at any time. So the flow is low during or before the rain event, and then some rainstorm comes along, stream flow rises, it reaches a peak either during or after the rain event, and then begins to recede. You can take the area underneath this curve, and it tells you the total amount of storm flow for that particular rain event. And what we found in our paper was that during dry or drought years, there was more total storm flow, so more area underneath this curve, suggesting that the peaks were higher and that these recession limbs were longer. Now, in wet years, total storm flow was less, so the area under this curve was smaller, suggesting that the peaks were lower and that these recession limbs were shorter. And so from this, we hypothesized that drought was damaging the vegetation, reducing the transpiration, which you guys all keyed in on, and this produced more storm flow. It was the opposite in wet years when vegetation was healthy, right? So transpiration was maximized, and because transpiration was maximized, less of that water became flow. Now, we were only able to hypothesize this from our early paper, and we can actually measure the differences between the orange, the brown, and the green lines. And so in this first part, I want to show you how we measure the differences between the seasonal differences basically in these recession limbs of the hydrograph. And we're going to do this by just using a recession analysis, which is actually more common in sort of hydrogeology. But I'm going to show you what it can tell us about vegetation as well. So again, I'm going to show you this data from the Coweta Hydrologic Lab. It's from a single catchment, watershed 14, which is this catchment outlined in yellow. And we're going to use 30 years of stream flow data. Remember, it takes a lot of data to look at these types of signals. And we're going to use both measured and model data for this particular study. So what is a recession analysis? So they're actually pretty simple because you just need one variable, and that's stream flow or Q. And what you do is you take that stream flow Q and you plot it against how quickly Q or stream flow is changing over time. So this is denoted by the dq dt here. And typically these analyses use decades of streamflow data to estimate how water is moving through things like aquifers. And the gray sort of blob of data in the background here is showing you this long-term data set, which is telling us again something about the aquifer. And when we fit black lines to the boundary of this point cloud, we can get some aquifer characteristics. What you'll find is that when you peer into this point cloud more clearly, you can start to pick out individual storm events. And this is what Shaw and Rhea showed in 2012, was that individual storm events were varying within this big blob and that they varied seasonally, right? And that when you fit a line through each storm event and you follow that line to the y-intercept, and you do that for every storm, and you take those y-intercept values and plot them through time, it gives you this really nice relationship where that alpha or intercept value is highest during the summertime and lower during the spring and fall. One thing to note here is that they use Julian day on the x-axis as sort of a proxy for potential evapotranspiration, or PET. Now, potential evapotranspiration is really just a climate variable, and so it's only telling us how hot and how dry it is. And remember, we don't really care. We want to know what transpiration is doing, right? We want to know how much water the vegetation is using. But before we jump into how much water the vegetation is using and how that relates to alpha or y-intercept, let's first look at our data plotted similar to this. So using our 40 years of measured and modeled streamflow, we found similar seasonal variation in our streamflow recession, right? So we have our gray blob, as I showed before, but within the gray blob, we have individual storm events. I'm just showing you a sample from each season. When we fit a line through all of our storms, and we got their y-intercepts, and then plotted those through time, those y-intercept values changed in a sinusoidal way, right? It's kind of curvy, where summer tends to be high, fall is a little high too, and they tend to be lower towards the spring. But again, I want to remind you though, we're plotting this through time, right? And it's only telling us about potential evapotranspiration, so hot and dry. But really, we care about how much water the vegetation is using. So this is where we used the model. We used it to estimate transpiration or vegetation, or how much water the vegetation is using. And we plotted those alpha values or y-intercept values against that. And what we found was that there's no relationship, right? There's no relationship between alpha or the y-intercept of our storm events and transpiration or vegetation water use. But it's not until you start to look closer and you start to group these points by month that a pattern emerges. Now, the numbers that I'm showing in this figure correspond to the seasons. And they correspond to sort of 4, April, 5 being May, and then so on. But what you'll see is that these alpha values start to increase in the late spring and then into the summer. They peak in about September and then begin to sort of decline as we move into the fall, which is an interesting finding. We're seeing this complex interaction between transpiration and alpha values, but you're probably like really lost because alpha values are really confusing to think about. At least they were for me whenever I was writing and analyzing this paper. So it's really helpful to always bring this back to reality and kind of give you a background on what these alpha values actually mean. So when these alpha values were lower in the springtime, this means that our streamflow recessions were longer, right? They take longer to return back to the base flow. So the total storm flow that's being generated is larger, right? The area under the curve, including this green line, is bigger. But as we move into the summer, vegetation starts rapidly extracting water. And what that means is that there's less water going to the stream. And so our stream flow recession is much faster. It peaks and then it quickly returns back to the base flow condition. Therefore, the amount of storm flow is under the area under this curve is smaller. And then finally, as we move into fall and winter, this starts to rebound back up to the spring value. I'll go one step further and maybe just show you a little cartoon about what's happening. And we'll just sort of start in the winter and maybe work our way around. But in the winter, the entire sort of soil subsurface is just wet, right? It's wet at all depths. The shallow zone is wet and the groundwater tables are really high. And when the vegetation blooms in the spring and then the early summer, they start to extract water from this light blue zone, that shallow zone, because that's where the roots are. And so what happens is that water that would flow to the stream is now being used by the vegetation. And that's when we're starting to see a really large effect of vegetation controlling stream flow. So that's in the spring, but then as we start to move through the summer, things start to dry out, right? This groundwater table starts to drop. And so it's no longer being recharged by soil moisture from the top. And this means that the impacts of vegetation on stream flow are going to be less as we get into the summer and then back into the fall, because now the groundwater table is low. Any rain that's falling is either being immediately used by the vegetation, and it's probably not reaching the stream. Instead, most of the flow is coming from that deeper groundwater source. And it sort of, starts to wet back up again as we move back into the fall. Now, this is showing you all kind of what is happening seasonally, right? I'm showing you kind of the differences between spring, summer, fall, and winter. But as I mentioned towards the beginning of this talk, climate change is changing these forests in Appalachia, meaning that, the vegetation dynamics are not just changing seasonally, but they're changing like interannually, and they're even changing at decadal time steps. So maybe even up to like 100 years, right? This forest looks very different than it did 100 years ago. And so over those stream flow recession events that I was showing you, one summer will start to look different through time than a summer in the future. And so what we really want to capture is how these changing forests are starting to change, those hydrographs potentially into the future. Okay, so for this next part, I want us now to consider the longer term changes in vegetation dynamics, not just seasons. And to simplify the whole climate change thing, let's just think about drought for this part. Now, as I mentioned before, we're seeing these increasing droughts in Appalachia, right? So, my question, I guess, for you is, what happens now to transpiration during these severe droughts? So, as before, unmute, put it in the chat. So what we actually see is that when the ecosystem sort of constricts, right, during a drought year, what we see is that transpiration decreases. But that this lower transpiration means that it's partitioning more of the rain that does fall into stream flow. So you were totally right that stream flow will also decrease, but the nuance here is just that how the ecosystem partitions whatever rain falls, whether it's a lot or a little, is just different. And so what we're seeing is that the droplets that do fall, more of the droplets will end up in the stream rather than going into transpiration. And we can talk about that nuance a little bit if it's still confusing after, I guess, I finish the talk. But one important thing is that tree species reduce their consumption, right, during droughts, and that the way in which tree species reduce their consumption of water or reduce their transpiration varies. And this can lead to a reduction in water use even after a drought subsides. So let's say that, yes, you were right, and that stream flow will reduce because there's less rainfall. But if the trees are damaged by drought, when rainfall returns to normal and stream flow kind of returns to normal, the transpiration may still be really low. This area may still be small, which means that a large bulk of that water can now flow into the stream. So we'll explore this a little bit more, and hopefully it'll become a little bit clear as I walk through the next few slides. So, for this second part, I want to just focus on this drought signal, right? And how vegetation responds to drought, and then what that means for hydrology. So, when a tree transpires, that water must flow through the soil into the roots, then into the xylem or stem, and then finally into the leaves before reaching the atmosphere and becoming transpiration. But when a tree experiences drought stress, the flow of this water through it can be interrupted at any of these points. And what's really important to consider for the next part is that how a tree responds to drought and where it interrupts this flow of water is going to vary by species. Now, this is really complex, right? And there's literally an entire field dedicated to studying how trees transpire and how water travels through them and how they respond to drought. But for this section, I really want to just simplify all of this complexity, because I want to understand an individual tree at a whole watershed scale, right? If we're interested in stream flow, we can't just look at a single tree, but we have to look at the whole forest. And we have to keep in mind too that in Appalachia, these forests are biodiverse. And so it's not simply just one tree that lives here, it's a whole bunch of trees. And so we have to think about also how these trees are distributed across a hill slope. So where we may get, more drought tolerant species living towards the ridges, and we may get less drought tolerant species living towards the stream. And this spatial variation of species means there are also there's also a spatial variation in transpiration, and this spatial variation in transpiration is going to impact the hydrology. So if we go back to our little water droplet, right, and this water droplet falls, let's say, at the top of this forest, and it's trying to make its way down to the stream, if we have more drought tolerant species living towards the ridges and they're conserving water, then this droplet may simply bypass the roots, right? They're conserving water, and so it's not going to turn into transpiration, but it reaches the bottom and there's a bunch of trees that are drought intolerant and they're just pumping away. They don't even care it's a drought, and that droplet then becomes transpiration. That means that we're potentially seeing less water reaching the stream. And so I want us to sort of consider that as we kind of walk through, again, the next few slides. And trying to understand future stream flow and how it's going to be impacted by future forests, models are a really great way for exploring this, right? The models can tell us a lot about the future climate and future water resources, but there's a big caveat. Hydrologic models, or models that simulate stream flow, they don't look at individual tree species. They don't care about how water really flows through the tree. They don't really care about sort of the drought response of individual species. They just want to simulate stream flow. And so in this paper, I look at bringing in some of those species-specific characteristics and species-specific drought responses into a hydrologic model to understand and scale from a single tree to an entire forest. So for this, you don't need to know anything about plant hydraulics or ecohydrologic models, other than to know that we have pulled in equations from a plant hydraulics model into a larger ecohydrologic model. And so plant hydraulics models just simulate water flowing through a single tree. And they're really good at doing that. And they're really good at simulating how those trees respond to drought and where that water is interrupted in the tree. Ecohydrologic models, or ecologic plus hydrologic models, they don't care about any of that. They just model a leaf. They assume the whole forest is one giant leaf, and they ignore everything below that. And so what we did was we just simplified our typical plant hydraulics model down to just one tree component, the xylem or the stem. Okay, so now why model the xylem and incorporate the flow of water through xylem into these larger models? Well, it's because xylem are important for a few reasons. One is that they respond very differently than leaves do, even on the same tree. And they can do things like suffer permanent or semi-permanent damage from drought, which means in a sense that they kind of remember drought, right? Like if they're damaged and it takes them a while to repair themselves, if the following year is not a drought year, they still may be limiting the amount of flow or the amount of transpiration that whole tree can do. And so that gets to this last point that when xylem are damaged, they reduce this conductance of water through the whole tree. So this is a really, really important feedback mechanism that we simply don't model. Now, the susceptibility again of xylem to impairment during drought varies by species. And so, for two species commonly found in Coweta, oaks and maples, their xylem respond super differently to dry soils. So what I'm showing here on the left is basically how dry the soil is on the x-axis. So this is really wet soils, this is really dry soils. And then I'm showing you the ability of the xylem to conduct water. This is a 100% ability to conduct water, and this is a 0% ability to conduct water. And what you can see is that oaks in this dashed line, as soon as the soils get a little dry, they lose their ability. The xylem lose the ability for water to flow through them. Maples, however, they're less sensitive, right? It takes really, really dry soils before the xylem are like, okay, let's stop with all the flow. So, these two differences are really important. And we can kind of generalize them in this way. We can say that oaks tend to have sensitive xylem, so they're sensitive to drought, but that oaks are also they have lower overall conductance, right? They don't transpire they don't use a lot of water, frankly. They're slow and steady growers. And so this slowness actually makes them pretty drought tolerant. They can hold their breath for a while during a water shortage. Red maples, however, they're the opposite. Their xylem tend to be really insensitive, but that overall they use a ton of water. And so this makes them drought intolerant. So even during dry periods, they're still trying to suck water from the soil, even though that water might not be there, which can be a problem. So to start, I want to show you what leaf and xylem conductance are doing in this new enhanced model over a drought period for are oaks. And just to remind you that when we're looking at xylem and leaf conductance, that water must first flow through the xylem before it can flow through the leaf. Okay. So in this graph on the left, I'm showing the rate at which water is flowing through the xylem and the leaf on the y-axis. So really fast flows through that particular component and really slow flows or zero or no flows through that particular component. And this is just over a dry down period in one of the most severe droughts in Coweta. And what we find in oak trees is that the xylem in this dashed line reduce the ability for water to flow through them at the peak of the drought. So much so that even if the leaves are happy and they're saying, hey, let's just go ahead and remove all the water we want, the xylem are like, no, we can't. And so the xylem is basically limiting the flow of water through this entire tree, despite the leaves saying, oh no, conditions are great, let's pump away. And it's this interaction that's really important. And it's during these periods that xylem reduces the flow and these blue arrows moving through the tree. Now, our maple simulations don't show this at all. They regulate everything by the leaf. So when the leaves are happy, they're pumping away. Now, there are both good and bad reasons for why you want to be able to slow your water using the xylem, using this particular component. One good reason is that if you have the ability to slow water using the stem or the trunk of a tree, as in our oak simulations, you're going to one, transpire less. And what that means is you're going to leave more water in the subsurface. And so this is just showing you the soil moisture change. So it's positive, saying that the soil moisture is increased under an oak tree because it's regulating its water use. And that there's a lot more water at the peak of the drought in the soils remaining because oaks have this ability to slow their water down. One bad reason, obviously, is that if you slow your water use, you can't grow, right? And so this is just showing you the change in transpiration. So that green arrow, right, that was pointing up, it's negative for oaks, and it's very negative. And that means that they're also not able to photosynthesize. But these types of feedbacks between incorporating xylem into these models and showing what happens to hydrology because of vegetation response haven't really been explored before in hydrologic models until now. And so I want to now kind of explore some important implications of this at different scales. So I'll bring up our familiar diagram here to show you that during droughts, oaks reduce the green arrow, so transpiration, which means they enhance the blue arrow. So kind of, we'll just say hydrology to be general. But at the smallest scale, at just a single tree scale or a couple tree scale, what that means is that having more water in that subsurface in the soils means that if your neighbor is stressed out because they don't have water, they might be able to borrow some of the water that you've left in the subsurface. Now, if we move to a slightly larger scale and think about a whole hill slope, oaks tend to live near the ridges, right? So the water that they are leaving behind may actually start to flow down slope, right? And what this means is that if the ecosystem down slope is actually stressed and they need water, then maybe they have more to access in this oak mixed forest. And then finally, at sort of the largest catchment scale, if these forests are mixed with oaks, then the oaks may start to allow enough water to flow downslope and reach the stream. And so what that means is that in these mixed forests with oaks, we may actually start to see greater stream flow during a drought. Okay. So what do our forests sort of look like today? So I just mentioned that we primarily see our maples living downslope and our oaks living upslope. And this is pretty typical for this part of Appalachia. But we've seen decades of fire suppression, right? Whenever there's a forest fire, we put it out. We don't really do controlled burns to manage these forests. And this fire suppression can have some interesting consequences on these forests, because fire is a natural sort of disturbance that oaks require basically to regenerate. And so without this fire, oaks can no longer kind of regenerate and grow and spread. And what this means is that there's a future in which oaks may start to disappear from these forests, even though I just spent the last 10 minutes telling you how important oaks are to hydrology and to ecosystem resilience to drought. And so this brings up some really important management, sort of management ideas, right? In which we might want to consider prescribing burns in some particular forests to manage and help enhance the regeneration of oaks. Because understanding this partitioning of rainfall into transpiration and into stream flow is going to be really critical, right, for enhancing our hydrologic recovery from future drought. And just even some of this research that I showed shows that reducing this rapid ecological recovery through things like forest management of oaks can actually help enhance our stream flow into reservoirs during periods of water stress. Okay, I have taken you guys on quite a journey. And so I'm just gonna really quickly sort of recap what we went over, and then we can kind of end it with some Q&A. So the first big finding here, right, was that over a storm event, we saw that vegetation partitioned the rainfall into transpiration and stream flow differently depending on whether it was spring, summer, or fall. But we also found that delaying ecosystem recovery and having the ability to slow down the water use through your xylem could promote greater soil moisture and potentially greater stream flow. And that can have really important implications for potentially our water resources. So with that, I just want to say thank you. This obviously I didn't do any of this work by myself. It was a whole host of people, lots of funding. And with that, I can take any questions if we have time.